Yeah. Hi, my name is Donna Royal, and this is the second authors training webinar for Penn. And so today, I guess I should say in the first webinar, we really discussed having a focused research question, asking a question in the PICO format, and then went through a search strategy in terms of acquiring evidence to answer the question. I'm going to continue a little bit along acquiring in terms of looking at the best available evidence, as well as appraising the evidence and applying that evidence in writing a Penn practice question today. So I do have the pleasure of having a couple participants that will hopefully stop and ask me questions along the way if things are moving too quickly or it's unclear. So we looked at this last time. Acquiring is the first step when we're looking at what's retrieved in our search, the hierarchical literature retrieval to look at, first of all, secondary sources, the best available evidence, and primary sources. So I want to continue on to look a little bit more detail about what the best available evidence is within those secondary sources and primary sources. So first of all, systematic reviews. Systematic review is a rigorous systematic approach to review primary studies on a topic. It doesn't mean a systematic review doesn't mean that it's high quality evidence. The studies in the review will determine the quality of evidence, but a systematic review should have an explicit and comprehensive search strategy, so it would be reproducible if anyone else were to do it. It should have a rigorous methodology described that they're using to interpret and assess the evidence. And if possible, a meta-analysis can be done to combine results to get overall, to describe overall results amongst the studies. And a good systematic review as well includes a well-developed question that considers harms as well as benefits and costs where applicable. So again, keep in mind that a systematic review doesn't mean high quality evidence, but when there are multiple systematic reviews available, how do you determine the best quality systematic review? So that's the first thing we'll look at, because we don't want to use multiple systematic reviews to answer a question, because we end up using the same studies in multiple cases. So one way to determine the quality of a systematic review is if it used a grade process. And so grade is a specific methodology which stands for grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. And this methodology was developed by a working group to really have a transparent approach to grading the quality or the certainty of evidence. And so if it uses this grade methodology, it will describe it as such, grade, and it rates the certainty of evidence from high to very low. And generally, clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, will start as high quality evidence, but for the specific outcomes, that evidence can be downgraded by looking at a number of factors, including risk of bias and whether there's inconsistency and imprecision. Non-randomized studies would generally start as lower quality evidence, but could be upgraded if there was a dose response or a large effect size. If clinical practice guidelines are using the grade methodology, which is a systematic review and evaluating the evidence using grade, they would also develop a recommendation which would consider benefits and harms, values and preferences, and costs. So there could be a strong or conditional recommendation, and also considering the certainty of evidence. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If it used a grade methodology, a good quality systematic review, very transparent and rigorous in terms of the methodology. If there is no grade, another way to look at the quality of a systematic review is AMSTAR checklist. And AMSTAR stands for Assessing the Methodological Quality of Systematic Reviews. In AMSTAR 2 in particular, help was developed to appraise systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials and non-randomized studies of healthcare interventions. And there are 16 criteria that they consider in terms of evaluating a systematic review. The ones I have highlighted in yellow here are the critical domains. So if any of these were lacking, it could be certainly enable the appraisal of the systematic review as being, move it from high to moderate to low to critically low. So things like, what is there a review protocol that was developed to describe the review before they started the review? How comprehensive was the search strategy? Did they justify for excluding individual studies? Did they assess the risk of bias for individual studies that are included in the review? And did they use appropriate meta-analytical methods? Did they interpret the results based on the risk of bias in the studies? And did they assess publication bias? So those are some of the critical domains, but if you go on the website, there's a checklist to go through to assess a systematic review to determine whether or not how it's rated in terms of the confidence in the results of the review. So narrative reviews are not systematic reviews. They are more susceptible to bias because they can, the authors who could be experts in the field are selectively citing studies, and they may not evaluate the quality of included studies. But if there isn't a systematic review available to answer your question, a narrative review can be useful because it can consolidate, several primary studies together and describe it. Ideally, if you're looking at a narrative review, there should be a search strategy that would describe, the dates and the databases that were searched. And there should be evidence that it's balanced and objective. It's not too opinion-based. But that is another secondary source that could be considered if there was no systematic review available. Let's not forget primary studies because primary studies, may need to be considered when there's an older systematic review, and so we have more recent evidence that wasn't included in the review. It may be if there's some important outcomes that are included in a primary study that weren't included in the systematic review. For example, something that's measuring, assessing quality of life or activities of daily living in a primary study, when the systematic review only may be considered mortality or morbidity, incidence of disease. So primary studies might have some other important outcomes. And ultimately, of course, if there is no review available, a primary study should be should be examined to see what information is available on the topic. So not all studies primary studies are equal, and many of you will have seen this sort of hierarchy of evidence to help us understand that that some studies, by virtue of their study design, are better quality than others. It reminds us that information that's based on expert opinion or consensus or animal research or in vitro studies would be the lowest quality evidence. Observational studies, case series or case reports, then case control studies, then cohort studies. Observational studies are commonly used in nutrition research, especially when we're looking at evidence for effects of dietary patterns or specific nutrients on prevalence of disease or etiology of disease or prognosis for disease. And certainly when studies can be combined in systematic reviews, more information is available, can be higher up the hierarchy. And randomized controlled trials tend to be towards the top of the hierarchy. Better quality evidence to answer a question about the effects of an intervention. Clinical practice guidelines are along the bar, a bar along the side. I mean, it can include any type of study designed to answer a question, hopefully the best available evidence to answer a question. Just a little bit more information on randomized controlled trials, RCTs, to remind us that although they are considered a strong quantitative research design because they're comparing two or more groups when the participants are assigned to these groups in a random fashion, but keeping in mind that a way to assess the quality of randomized controlled trial is assessing a risk of bias, because RCTs can suffer from weaknesses if they weren't truly randomized. If the randomized process wasn't blinded, so the participants and the personnel or how the outcome assessor wasn't blinded. If there was a high dropout rate and they didn't account for those participants, or if there was selective reporting of outcomes, so not all the outcomes were reported, just some of the outcomes. So a systematic review in consolidating the results of randomized controlled trials would have a graph similar to what you're looking at on the right, which shows the risk of bias for the studies combined to identify, whether or not a green is showing those that are a low risk of bias for those particular criteria. Yellow is unclear risk of bias, and red is high risk of bias. So yes, we do need to look at the quality of the individual studies to determine how confident we feel in the evidence. So just some things to keep in mind, and when we're talking about study design, that observational studies, as I indicated, they are common in dietary or nutrition research, but they can't be taken as proof of causation because of the number of confounding or related variables that can impact it. So we can look at dietary factors as risk factors or associations, but we can't prove causation. And that even a single study, even a well-designed one, doesn't provide enough evidence for us to change clinical practice. We wouldn't rate it as high quality evidence if we don't see it replicated in multiple studies. If we do have, though, well-designed clinical trials with consistent results, we can begin to assume some causation and have more confidence in the quality or in the evidence to provide a stronger recommendation. So relating this back then to the search strategies we were looking at before, we're thinking about the hierarchical evidence and identifying the systematic or secondary research or primary research right from the beginning. As we're starting to look at the articles that were retrieved, we can exclude some right away based on relevancy. Does it address the PICO question? And I want to remind you about those patient important outcomes here. If you're looking at a study or a review that's looking at an obscure outcome, then maybe it's not, that it could be excluded from the get-go. And so, for example, something that's looking at an immune measure, a biochemical measure, and not looking at something more broadly related to, as I've indicated, for a food insecurity intervention, something that would be more relevant to the population. How is it affecting their function or their quality of life? So many studies right away can be excluded just by looking at the title or the abstract. And when you start to look a little bit more deeper into the studies, it's good to take those, start to organize them either by population. You might be looking at adults or children, or by the intervention. You might be looking at interventions that were done in, food banks versus those that were done in community kitchens. Or by outcomes, those outcomes that look at very broad clinical endpoints versus those that are looking at more specific or psychological endpoints. So as you're starting to organize the contents based on relevancy, you can also be starting to look at the quality of, when you're looking at the full text of the paper, looking at the highest quality secondary research or a high quality impactful primary study, something that really would have an impact on practice versus a nice to know. Any comments or questions so far about?
I have one question just to double check. If all there is available is either expert opinion or animal studies or cell studies, do we just not mention those in Penn, or do you put like a grade D, no evidence available? What would be the procedure in that?
That's a good question, Lisa. And I think that what we are generally saying now is that those type of studies, if they don't fit our hierarchical approach, we don't need to discuss results of animal studies or in vitro research. It could be described as a mechanism of action in the comments when we look at writing content for Penn, but we really don't need to describe the evidence. We can say that, and I will be talking about the Penn evidence grading system, but that would be considered a D grade where there's no evidence available from human studies. Yeah, thanks.
I have another question along similar line.
Yes.
Like, where would qualitative type evidence fit within that hierarchy?
Thank you for that too. And we do actually have another pyramid, which I didn't include in this presentation, for qualitative research. It is very challenging to grade evidence for qualitative research. We acknowledge that as a challenge. It can be exploratory or descriptive, and so it has a place in describing it. But I will try to include, we do have evidence in one of our training modules, so I can't pull up the slide here, but the training module on reviewing study designs on the website that has some information on qualitative research. I'll try to pull that up towards the end of our session if we have some time. Thanks for that. So we have been alluding to how we appraise the evidence based on, some factors like the risk of bias in clinical trials. I want to just identify that when we're appraising the evidence in Penn, we're looking at all the evidence included together. So the best available evidence and appraising it together to come up with the strength of our recommendations. So the Penn grading system is based on study designs and study quality and the number of studies, also the consistency of the evidence, the clinical impact, its applicability, and generalizability. So we do use an ABCD grading system: good evidence, fair evidence, limited evidence or expert opinion is grade C, or grade D is there is no conclusion possible because of extremely limited evidence or when the evidence is such poor quality or contradictory. We do have, I'll give a couple of examples of what this would look like in terms of the evidence that was retrieved. So for a grade A or good evidence, we have results from studies that are a strong research design, clear methodology, and sufficient sample size. So for a treatment or intervention question, looking at the effect of a specific dietary treatment on a health condition, for example. Um, a grade A would be a good quality systematic review of clinical trials with consistent findings and all at low risk of bias, or multiple clinical trials that would be at low risk of bias. If it was more a question about etiology or prognosis, what is the contributing factor of, of breastfeeding, for example, on infant and maternal health? If it was a systematic review of cohort studies with that were very similar, there was little there's homogeneity amongst the studies, or these well done prospective cohort studies with consistent results and large treatment and exposure effects. So it can be very challenging to get grade A evidence. If it was using the grade at the bottom, I've got, if that grade process was used, if it was high certainty of evidence, it would be considered grade A. And so as we start to move down B, C, and D, fair evidence, we still could have studies from a strong research design, but now there are some methodological concerns or inconsistencies. And if it was a weaker design, the results are generally consistent. So now we have for treatment intervention where there's some clinical trials, but there's some heterogeneity amongst the studies in terms of the interventions or the outcomes. We might have a single clinical trial, but a very well done, low risk of bias trial, or some multiple clinical trials that have a clinically important conclusion, but were a little less clear, an unclear risk of bias. Etiology or prognosis, some systematic review of cohort or case control studies with some consistent findings. So minor doubts about the significance of the results and generally applicable. If it was using that grade methodology, it would be a moderate certainty of evidence to be grade B. And then grade C, now we have limited evidence, weaker design studies, or inconsistent uncertainty because of inconsistencies. So we've got some clinical trials that might be at high risk of bias, a non-randomized trial, or for a treatment intervention, it could be a systematic review of observational studies with consistent findings. If we're looking at a question related to etiology or prognosis, it would be more related to some inconsistent results in the studies. Grade evidence would be low or very low certainty of evidence. And grade D, it's fine to say, if it's such a poorly designed or executed trial, or based on a single case report or case series, in vitro, ex vivo, or animal models, or with such contradictory results. In some of those cases, we don't need to be describing the evidence for those. We can just say there is no evidence. If it is from a case series or case control, or it's very contradictory, it would be good to at least have a brief description of it, but to say that we really can't make a conclusion because it's too limited. So to help with that, on the Penn website, when we look at the training and review or resources, which maybe we'll get a chance to do at the end of this webinar, there is an evidence grading checklist that describes the criteria to achieve these conclusions for each of those grades of evidence. A reminder that now that we've been looking at putting together the search strategy, we looked at that in the first webinar. There will be reasons that some noteworthy studies could be excluded. In this case, in the case, as I said, where you have multiple systematic reviews that are of a similar date range and maybe similarly, addressing the PICO, what were the reasons for excluding some of them, not reporting them in pen? And it could be related to the fact that they were a lower quality review, for example, or a lower quality review, or that some other concerns about that the outcomes were less relevant than the ones that were included, the one that was included. So that's all part of, what are the studies that that I have selected and my justification for including them in pen. And that does bring us to the next part of this webinar, which is really about taking then the evidence that you've identified as the best available evidence and writing it into a pen question. And so we'll talk about applying what you found in terms of writing the information in pen and grading the evidence. So, anatomy of a pen question. If you think about how it's organized, and I will be showing you some examples in pen of this, there are potentially 4 parts to a pen question. One is the key practice point, which is what shows up first when you look at the answer to the question in pen. The next part is the evidence that describes the articles that have been included. Comments or rationale can support the information in the evidence, and then the references. So when you're thinking of writing the content for pen, the first place I want to take you to is right in the middle, which is the evidence. You can't start with providing a key practice point or a recommendation until you can really adequately describe the evidence for the articles that you've included. So we'll start in the middle by looking at evidence, or these evidence statements. So an evidence statement is for each document, for each article you're using, you're providing an overview of it so that the pen user should have a good snapshot of the article and why it's been used to support the key practice point, and ultimately how it influences the grade of evidence for the key practice point. It shouldn't be just a regurgitation of the paper's abstract. That would be might be too biased in terms of the information. You need to have really be looking at the full text of the article and thinking about. I always think about PICO when I'm writing the evidence statement. First of all, describing the type of study or the review. So was it a clinical trial, an observational study, or was it a systematic review or a narrative review? And then PICO, how do I describe the populations that were studied, either by a disease condition or by some demographics, the number of subjects, if it was in a primary study, or maybe the number of studies that were included if it was a systematic review. And then what is the intervention? And even if it's an observational study, there's still some comparison to, high versus low intake, or what was the intervention and what was the comparison condition that we're really talking about here to be able to better evaluate it. And sometimes that requires better description of an intervention. If it was a diet counseling intervention, for example, how it was delivered. If it was an observation of dietary intake, was it by, comparing high intake assessed by, food frequency questionnaires? And then what were the outcomes? What are the key results and outcomes? And again, you don't need to report everything that was reported in the article. Again, you're thinking of what are the key results or outcomes that you or the dietitians that's reading this are interested in. If they do identify what their primary outcome is, you'd want to be reporting it as their primary outcome. But some secondary outcomes could also be important. Sometimes it helps to explain the author's main conclusion as relates to the results, But in order to be able to interpret this and give it a grade of evidence, we also want to be identifying the study limitations and an assessment of the quality of the studies, so that we can ultimately assign a grade of evidence to it and interpret it. So I'll take you to a couple of examples in pen to show you what this looks like, and then encourage you to ask some questions. I'm laughing here because we might get cut off. It's saying we only have 4 minutes remaining, so we might have to take a pause and rejoin in a moment, but we'll see how we do. So this is an example of information in pen. I'll read it out to you because it may not be too clear. I took an example of a question from the pregnancy knowledge pathway, and there's many questions in this knowledge pathway. This is one that was about the efficacy and safety of herbal medicines used for inducing or shortening labor. And it starts with a key practice point, but I want to take you down to the evidence, a description of the evidence that we were just looking at. And this one happens to be based on a systematic review and meta-analysis, and there is a reference for it if we scroll down. And so the author who wrote this is describing that it was based on both clinical trials and observational studies conducted to investigate the efficacy and safety of herbal medicines used for the induction of labor. They are describing the number of studies, 10 studies included, and describing the populations. They were clinical trials. They were often in women who had low-risk pregnancies. And then what were the interventions? Many different interventions: castor oil, what the dose was, raspberry leaf, herbal medicine exposure. And because there were so many different outcomes, what they've done to help organize the outcomes is just break it into, the results using the castor oil related to the likelihood of giving birth, and they're reporting the rates here, the rates of cesarean section, occurrence of assisted vaginal delivery. So this evidence statement is describing in some detail the results of just this one systematic review. Another example, what are the effects of shared meal times in residential care settings on nutritional outcomes in older adults, 65 years of age or older? Again, the key practice point is including a recommendation, evidence summary, and remarks. But if we go to the evidence, there's a few evidence statements here. One is a systematic review, and they're describing the results of the systematic review. And because this was looking at mealtime interventions, the systematic review, it didn't include all of their important outcomes. The mealtime interventions were related to feeding assistance, food improvement, staff training in food service, and dining environment changes. But it didn't include, they chose to include a study that was published after the review that looked at the effects of dining together and using a controlled design. And they've also included a narrative review because it was, in particular, had looked at shared meal interventions, which weren't included in this in the systematic review, specifically shared meal interventions. And then there was also an umbrella review of systematic reviews looking at enhancing nutritional outcomes on older adults, which was also relevant because it included some different interventions. So a couple of different ways of ways that evidence, or examples of how evidence was included to answer the specific questions. One where it was only based on a systematic review, and other based on multiple